Yes, hello. I'm Jason Louv. This is the Ultra Culture Podcast, and today I'm talking to Pam Grossman. Pam is a remarkable woman. She is really the person that's pushing forward on the massive popularity of witchcraft among young women and in the world in general, and particularly the archetype of the witch as a symbol of female empowerment. I met Pam last year at the Esoteric Book Conference in Seattle, which is one of the top conferences for esoteric and occult topics in America. I went there to present on the John Dee book, although I hadn't finished it at the time. That presentation is actually on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, if you just search Jason Louv. And one of my favorite things that happened to me during that conference was meeting Pam. We have some friends in common, particularly Scott Trelevin, who I've had on this podcast before, who I've known forever. But Pam and I very, very quickly, I think, just became friends. And I'm really, really happy about that. So let me tell you a little bit about Pam. So Pam currently is working on a new book called Waking the Witch, which is about the emergence of the witch as an archetype in pop culture and a symbol of female empowerment. She's working on that full time. So prior to taking the full-time plunge into the harrowing world of full-time writing, Pam has had a really spectacularly illustrious career, which she's been very recognized for in a lot of places. I'm just going to mention some of the highlights. She's done so many things that you will have to check out her website for the full list. It's pamgrossman.com. So most recently, she was Getty Images Director of Visual Trends, and that's an incredibly powerful role. She was presenting her research on commercial imagery at various Fortune 500 companies, global agencies, and conferences, including Sheryl Sandberg's leanin.org, female empowerment nonprofit, Google, Apple, Microsoft, MasterCard, American Express, the Oprah Winfrey Network, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the list goes on and on and on. And a lot of her work for Getty Images has focused on initiatives that use the power of imagery to shift perceptions, break stereotypes, and build a more inclusive, equitable world. She has been featured for that work in the New York Times, the Washington Post, O Magazine, Ad Age, Wired, BuzzFeed, the British Journal of Photography, NPR, BBC, CBS, and the list keeps going. She was named one of Marie Claire's 20 Women Changing the Ratio in their 20th anniversary issue in 2014. In 2015, her Lean In collection at Getty Images was the recipient of an International Center of Photography Infinity Award. She was selected as one of LinkedIn's Next Wave Top Professionals 35 and Under in 2016 and named one of Adweek's Creative 100 in 2017. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. She has curated the Language of the Birds art show at NYU, and that also has received tremendous coverage in the media. So Pam is somebody who has been able to combine a real interest in magic and the occult with profound success in the real world. That's a rare combination. It's really refreshing to see when it happens. And for that and many other reasons, I think Pam is an excellent role model for men and women, and somebody that I'm really, really happy to have on the podcast and to count as a friend. And I'm hoping to have her back on the podcast as well. And I'm really looking forward to her new book, Waking the Witch, which should be coming out in 2019. Okay, so you can find out more about Pam at pamgrossman.com. Her blog is phantasmaphile.com. And she also has a podcast called The Witch Wave, which is everywhere that podcasts can be found. So definitely sign up for that one as well. It's currently on hiatus, I believe, as she is currently on book deadline, but she was very gracious to take a bit of time to appear on the Ultra Culture podcast. We did have a little bit of call dropout during the interview. It shouldn't be that noticeable, but for that reason, you'll hear that we get straight into the thick of the interview, and that's why. Other housekeeping, I am switching my hosting from SoundCloud to Libsyn, which is just a more professional podcasting hosting platform. So I'm not sure if the podcasts are going to continue to be updated on SoundCloud, but they will be on the iTunes store. And I have also now put the podcast on Google Play and Stitcher. So you can get it at all of those spots. And I've submitted it to Spotify. So hopefully it'll be on Spotify soon, although Spotify may have closed their submissions in the short term. So fingers crossed, it should be on Spotify soon. But in the meantime, continue to follow the podcast at all those venues. If you enjoy this show and you're fascinated by the topic of magic, the occult, witchcraft, consciousness alteration, personal evolution, and meditation, mindfulness, and everything in between, please check out my online school, magic.me. You can get a free introductory course to magic by texting the word shaman, SHAMAN, to the phone number 44222 if you're in the United States. Otherwise, you can go to the URL free.magic.me/offer. That's magic with a K. So free.magic.me/offer. And you can get a free introductory 1-week course to magic. In terms of the full site, magic.me, the full training, the cheap prices are currently still in effect. I have not raised the prices yet, as I'm running to catch up with a billion things. So you might want to take advantage of that. The current prices on magic.me are going up, as I've mentioned a few times on the podcast. And particularly the lifetime deal is the best deal you will ever get on magic.me. It will be going away very shortly. So if you are interested in becoming a full subscriber, now's the time, because you will be locked in at that price and grandfathered in, and the prices will not raise for you if you're subscribed before the prices go up. Okay, you're really going to enjoy this interview. We had a great conversation. Please make sure you're subscribed to the podcast on iTunes or Google Play or Stitcher, particularly if you were previously only subscribed on SoundCloud. As I am moving away from SoundCloud, please leave a 5-star review. It really helps. And most of all, tell a friend, mention the show on social media. That's the best thing that we can do to help the show grow. All right. Good to talk to you, and on with the interview. Hey Pam, how's it going?
Hey Jason, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you very much for being on the podcast. It's been long in coming. We just met, I think, just a year ago or so, but I've been looking forward to having you on once I got the podcast going again. You were one of my very first choices for people to have on right away, and you've been very busy, right?
Yes. Well, first of all, I'm honored to be here, and the feelings are very mutual. I just love the work that you do. But yeah, it's been a busy time. I'm working on a book. I'm doing a podcast, and just rocking the witch world.
So you have talked a lot about the process of embodying the archetype of the witch, and I'm curious. That sounds like a transformational process. It sounds like something that you've eased into throughout your life, or that has become an ongoing thing for you. I'm curious what that process has been like and how it's evolved as your life has evolved.
Absolutely. So I suppose, the easiest starting point is childhood. And I know that I'm not unique in this, but when I was a kid, I always gravitated towards fairy tales and mythology, and as I often say, kind of the lowest section of the Dewey Decimal System in my library. And so any kind of books about magic and mythology and enigmas and cryptozoology were really romantic and attractive to me. And at the same time, as a kid, I grew up in New Jersey in the suburbs, but we had this little patch of woods behind our house. And it was there that I would do a lot of these intuitive rituals and deep imaginal play and enter those lovely trance states that, as we know, as children, we much more easily access. And when you put in a hearty helping of like 80s cartoon culture on top of that, like everything from She-Ra to Strawberry Shortcake and Care Bears and, Star Fairies, all of these really weird, quasi-psychedelic, imaginal kind of stories that often had magical female protagonists, I am certain that that had a big influence on me too. And I often say, most people grow out of their magic phase, and I just grew deeper into mine. And so fast forward to being a teenager and gravitating towards, the new age section of bookstores like Walden Books and B. Dalton at my mall, or I was fortunate in that I lived close enough to places like Red Bank, New Jersey, and New Brunswick, New Jersey, and New Hope, Pennsylvania, and New York City, where my dad commuted every day. And I would get to go sometimes. And all of these places were hubs for alternative culture and had new age bookshops, and also had, the cool record stores and, weird shops where I could get into comic books and bands and, all the writers who influenced me. And all of those creators that I gravitated towards also were dealing with magical tropes or using magical techniques to create their work. I'm talking about people like Tori Amos or Neil Gaiman or even Bjork, PJ Harvey, all these people who had such deep influence on me in my formative years. And then the last thing I'll say about being a teen is I also got really into female surrealism. So artists like Leonora Carrington and Remedios Varo and, folks who are right now just starting to get a little more popular. But back in the day, I kind of just stumbled on them flipping through art books. And these women were so ahead of their time in that they identified as witches and artists, and they were infusing their artwork with mythology and magic and spellcraft in a very conscious and intentional way, and putting themselves in their artwork and showing that their female experience, was worthy of putting a frame around. So it's really these different threads that influenced me. And then as I got into college and, discovered Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and some of those thinkers, I suppose, just to kind of cut to the chase, it was layers and layers and layers of kind of magical sediment that I accumulated, as I think it is for most of us.
Right, totally.
Yeah.
I think it sounds like we pretty much grew up around the same time and went through the same cultural experience. And I'm curious, you talk about making a decision not to grow out of your magical phase. That's a decision we both seem to have made. I'm curious what your thinking was around that, why you decided to lean more fully into it instead of into I don't know, becoming a banker or something like that, and maybe what the reaction to that was, and if you encountered pushback from parents, teachers, people in the world, and if there's been pushback on that going forward after making that decision.
Yeah, it wasn't like one day that I just made the decision. I don't know. I've always just had this part of myself that I've just identified very strongly with myself as an individual and trusting myself. And it's a really lucky thing that I've come to realize not everybody has. But for me, whatever I love and whatever makes me feel alive is the right thing to follow. And I think that's true of anyone. I don't care what it is that one's interested in or curious about. For me, it happened to be magic. And I was really fortunate too in that my parents are both artists. You know, my dad had a day job and my mom had a few day jobs over the years, but my dad is a musician and my mom is a painter. And so, you know, they would take me to art museums and they were really into the fact that I was a kind of kid who followed the beat of her own drum and things. So I was always encouraged to be myself. And it just so happened that myself was like this weird little witch kid, you know. My parents also, even though I was raised Jewish, they were very embracing of alternative spirituality. And, you know, over the years, my mom would go on goddess retreats and my dad would do meditation of different paths. And I think they just really supported any kind of curiosities I had. So I was safe there. But I did have a few relatives that were made a bit nervous by some of my dabblings. You know, I was doing magic, I was doing spells. And not only that, but some of the books in my house, you know, I had, the Satanic Bible. And I also had, I remember, a book of poems by the poet Sharon Olds called Satan Says, which is not, not a magical book in the traditional sense. But I often, as I said, talk about art and magic in the same breath, because to me, they're very much in relationship with each other. And these two books really freaked out an aunt of mine, and she was, you know, nervous about it. But you know, they were two books in a context of hundreds of other books. And, you know, it's not like the only thing I was gravitating toward was like demonic or devilish or satanic. And, you know, most of what I loved was more, you know, witchcraft without the devilish connotations. But still, you know, some of those books slipped through the cracks every now and again. And one can see how that could be a little alarming, I suppose.
So you mentioned witchcraft as something, a completely distinct field of study and of historical thinkers and a very distinct thing. And you have it very well defined. And I'm curious how you describe witchcraft, particularly to people who have never encountered that word before and maybe, let's say, triggered by that word in the same way that you're describing people being set off by, you know, the one book that has Satan in the title, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, Jason, that you say that I have a good definition for it, because the word witch alone is so complicated and nuanced. And I'm writing a whole book about it because it means so many different things to so many different people. And it has so many layers of association and context and nuance. So I think it's actually a really fluid word that varies depending on who's using it, how, and why. And same with the term witchcraft. So what I mean when I say I practice witchcraft is I do a version of spiritual practice that is ritual based, that incorporates the cycles of nature. So it's super pagan in its orientation. So I'm paying attention to the phases of the moon, the holy days of the pagan wheel. But I'm also doing spells, and those spells are about trying to manifest things, usually in my own life, occasionally for other people, though I don't really believe that doing a spell for someone else is as effective as it is to help someone do a spell for themselves, or at least give them something to complete or an action to do, which perhaps we can get into in a bit. And I have deities that I have relationships with. And, you know, in my tradition anyway, or my practice, these deities come from lots of different cultures, which is something that lately I've been calling into question and examining in this current age of really looking at things like cultural imperialism and appropriation. But I just want to be honest, it's something that I do. I do draw from all different mythological bases and sources. And I'm, using things like meditation and visualization and, working with different energies to literally transform my experience of this world.
So when
So
you talk about,
does that help?
yes, it does. Yes, of course. I'm curious when you talk about transforming your experience of this world, when we think about stabilizing spiritual practice, usually people either are looking for a goal or a place they want to get to, or they have gotten somewhere and they want to maintain a certain level of consciousness or way of being with the world. My experience of magic and witchcraft is often very much about the defense of the individual against a sometimes hostile world. It can sometimes be like the introvert's toolkit for managing existence on Earth, in my experience. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. Is there a place that you're trying to get to? If you could define, your reasons for engaging in witchcraft as a practice, what would they be? Or what would the ultimate end state be for you?
Yeah, and that's evolved over the years. So I think with many of us, when I was a teenager and a young adult, when I was doing witchcraft, it was very goal oriented, and those goals were pretty material. I have a crush on someone and I want to make out with them, or, I hope I get that job. And there's a very fine tradition of very specific goal oriented magic. And that's what a lot of these spells that one learns are for. But as I've gotten older, and I don't know, I'd like to think a little bit more mature, perhaps, or more trusting of the universe. Most of my magic now is about wanting to be in service to something greater than myself and wanting to be a vessel for compassion and creativity and love and magic. And sometimes it will be a specific goal. Like I'm certainly asking for a lot of help with my book, for example, but it's more about, can you please help me make this book be in service of a higher purpose? So I know that sounds, it's very kind of self-helpy, fuzzy Oprah-ish, but it really, to me, is the most powerful magic because I don't necessarily know. It's funny. There's a few schools of thought, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, Jason. There are some people who say you need to be as specific as possible in order to ask the universe, spirits, the gods, what have you, for what you want. And then there's this other school of thought that's like, can I curse on this, Jason? I should have asked you that before.
only in the profanity sense.
Yes. Oh, good answer. It's like, I don't fucking know like what the best thing is. I am just a human. So if I leave space for spirit to fill and trust that spirit is going to maybe even take me higher or help me be even more expansive or more useful or more in service than I could even imagine for myself in certain ways. I want to trust that. And so I kind of have come up with this third way, which is I occasionally ask for specific things, but more often than not, it's about just trying to align myself with the highest energy possible.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And that's more or less my take on it as well. In my life, I've certainly, I would have to say that the doing rituals to get stuff approach, I probably eased off on over 10, maybe even 15 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, well, I think you say it well towards the end of what you were saying there. Sometimes I think that the worst thing that can happen to people is they get what they want instead of what would actually be good for them. And I think that we come to a place, particularly, I think that if you're a magic practitioner, you come to that place quicker than most people do through trial and error. But we often come to a place where we realize we just don't know very much about the universe or ourselves, and the surrender becomes a very important part of practice. But also, wanting to be a conduit culturally, particularly when we live in such a dark cultural time. For me, that is kind of the core of the whole thing, trying to keep the lights on as much as I can.
Yes, that's so beautiful. And it's so important. And, for me, I think that a lot of spirituality, and this is not a popular thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. A lot of spirituality is about style. What flavor do you prefer? And for me, for whatever the reason, the aesthetics, the stories, the language, the rituals of witchcraft just really, they light my fire. But if someone else is getting there through Christianity or Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam, like I don't care. I really don't care, as long as the end goal is about raising as much compassion, kindness, love, and creativity as we possibly can.
I agree. Well, yeah, it's definitely there can be a style aspect to it. It's something I have certainly come across living in Los Angeles. I certainly in the occult world, people get very into their rings and their necklaces and the books they own and things like that. But then you go hang out with yoga people, and it's like the $300 Lululemon pants, and it's even more materialistic in a way. But I think that one thing that people have asked me about magic is there is an aspect of magic that does seem to directly act as an ego snare, in the sense that with magic, there's the explicit or implicit promise that you can have some type of special power or do rituals to get things, whether that's material or intangible. And that is not so much present in other spiritual traditions. And I sometimes think that it's that magic it's almost like it gives people just enough rope to hang themselves with, if you will, in the sense that it lays all that out there so that people can come to terms with that very quickly. Because when you approach it in the way of, I'm doing results magic, I'm getting stuff, you very quickly come up against the boundaries of your own, I don't know, delusion, your own ego. You can get what you want and then have to deal with it. And through that experience, people, I hope, begin to ask, well, what do I really want from life and from the universe? And then that becomes, hopefully, although probably not always, becomes an ongoing dialogue that leads to deeper and deeper levels of self-realization and meditation. And so I'm curious what your experience with that has been. And obviously something that I think we both have an interest in is stabilizing the Western traditions, whether that's ceremonial magic, witchcraft, Hermeticism, the various magical paths, stabilizing them as adult spiritual paths in the West. And that hasn't been done yet. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, or, it's kind of navigating some of these tricky issues, particularly as this becomes more popular and more people get into it.
Yeah. I mean, I might play, I was going to say devil's advocate, but that's a loaded phrase in this context.
Okay.
But I think that most spiritual traditions or most religions have results-oriented aspects to them. I mean, I think about, there's the whole path of abundance in Christianity, and there's, people go to, they take pilgrimages in India to certain temples in hopes that they'll get pregnant or get money or, cure a disease. I think that results-oriented workings, we might not call it magic, but prayers, rituals, offerings, to my mind, happens in virtually every spiritual path. And we're human beings who need help sometimes. And I don't actually think there's anything wrong with it. But of course, there's always a dark side to that. So I don't know
I
if
think
you
that's totally
disagree with
fair.
that.
No, I
Yeah.
don't. I totally agree with that. I think you're completely right. So, it's almost like magic is almost a bit more psychologically honest in a way, because when people do the things you're talking about, particularly from a ritual, or excuse me, a religious perspective, it's kind of begging a higher force. Oh, if I'm just good enough, will you please do this for me?
Mm-hmm.
If I say pretty please in just the right way, will you make my life go well?
Yeah,
Whereas,
if I put money in the tithing bowl, if I, like really, there really is
totally.
this exchange.
Whereas with magic, it's the assumption is more, well, it comes from the individual. The individual has some type of special power or is empowered in a way to just, just do it, as they say. So in a way, I see that as more psychologically healthy in that you're not dependent and you're not begging, unless you take that approach to magic. But on the other hand, it clearly leads to, and I'm sure we both have seen examples of this in our respective lives, it can clearly lead to, Fruza Balk syndrome.
What? Ooh, I'm gonna need you to define that for me. I mean, I know about her, but what syndrome do you think
Oh,
she's
oh,
responsible
oh, no, no, no.
for?
Well, sorry, not her specifically, but her character in the
Oh,
craft. Her character in
oh,
the
yes,
craft,
yes,
when
yes, 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 yes,
the
yes.
magician who
Nancy.
just gets the ego blowout and decides they're all powerful, and it goes terribly for
Oh,
them
good.
because
I'm
they're out of
so
check with others.
relieved. I was worried about Fruza Balk for a second. I was like, what happened? What did she conjure? And she does actually do magic in her real life, which is an interesting blur there between the
Yeah,
craft and
she used to own
yeah.
there's a cult shop on Hollywood Boulevard that she used to own that I bought a Franz Bardon
Yeah.
book at like 20 years ago or something like that, but I think she sold it.
Yeah, I think so too. And interestingly, Rachel True from The Craft, who I actually had on my podcast recently, she's a tarot reader, and she was a tarot reader before she even got cast in The Craft. So there's some real magic happening there. But we'll talk about that another time. Yeah, in terms of that kind of like Nancy syndrome of the magic going to your head, I mean, again, I think that can happen in any path. I think that if you are a lost soul or you're somebody who's trying to fill certain voids in your life with any kind of spiritual power, we see it in the right wing evangelical church right now. I mean, people who just get so entranced by power and seduced by it and corrupted by it. It could be the power of money that does that too. But I completely agree that we see it a lot in our shared community, Jason. And I think some of that is, to your point, this path is a self-directed path, and that's a blessing. And it can sometimes be its downside too, which is we don't have one book. We don't have one set of dogma. There's not one priest or one pope, And because of that, we don't need a mediator, and we have to trust ourselves, and we follow our own, as I like to say, path of cosmic breadcrumbs and find our way and gravitate towards whatever books or teachers or rituals call out to us. And that's a really beautiful thing, but it also means you really have to trust yourself and be healthy, because you can be seduced into thinking that you are in more control than you actually are, or thinking that this is going to answer all of your problems or solve all your problems. And I'm a big believer in, yes, be spiritual and go off in a trance, but then like come back to earth and pay your rent and be a good friend and show up on time. That if you don't take the magic and reapply it back into the material world, it's just a waste.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's certainly what Crowley would call confusing the planes. It's the mistake that everyone seems to make, where they think that what they do in a trance state or in a magical state somehow back applies to the rest of their life, particularly when they, are convincing themselves that they're reaching some type of heightened spiritual status or whatever it happens to be. And this always seems to be what leads people astray. But when you talk about being self-directed, I mean, it is a beautiful thing. It's also very dangerous because to be self-directed inevitably means that you will go through trial and error, and you will have hits and misses. And sometimes the misses in magic can be catastrophic. And so, while yes, we can certainly apply these things to all spiritual traditions, and I think probably just human life in general, maybe we should narrow it down just to our field here, just magic. Because I think the thing that I'm dancing around here, for me, the big question is, how can magic be stabilized as an actual tradition in the West? In my perspective, the Western esoteric tradition, or the magical traditions in all their branches, certainly not just the Western one, but I say the Western one, Western esoteric tradition, because it's my own, my own specific area of expertise. But the question of how these spiritual paths can be stabilized in an adult and non-juvenile way is a non-trivial question, right? Because first of all, of course, people immediately hit up against the cultural biases, where people will either be afraid of it or consider it juvenile at best, despite the depth of the tradition, which automatically throws up some massive hurdles to moving forwards towards cultural acceptance. But then the other one is the dangers of the practices themselves that we've been talking about. So I'm kind of asking this and talking to you. One of my interests in talking to you is that you seem like somebody who's stabilized it a bit. I mean, you've been, open about it. You've had a very successful professional career, being very open about your beliefs. And so I'm interested in what your experiences have been in that regard, and then how we can start thinking about stabilizing magical practitioners in an adult way.
Yeah, I mean, the answer that's coming to my mind is not my favorite answer, but I think it's true, realistically speaking, which is when you have institutions, especially academia and the art world, in my case, who are finally paying attention and quote unquote legitimizing these as real traditions and real paths, that to me is really helpful, because not only are we putting it in a context of study in a way that the average bear can understand, but there's also, I mean, I hate to say it, but there's funding behind it. There's real resource that are put behind celebrating and exploring and examining these different traditions. So I've been very heartened to see classes at certain universities, or even certain degrees now be offered in Western esotericism or Gnosticism, or different types of witchcraft-based lineage systems, and in the art world, there's of course always a gross side to it that we can risk when something we love becomes suddenly popular and money is put against it. Right. But there have been beautiful art exhibitions over the last 5 to 10 years that suddenly are celebrating the occult and magic as a really important influence on some of the most amazing creators and, creative geniuses of the last 100 to 200 years, if not longer. And so I think that helps stabilize it too.
I agree, and I'm very excited about that. I'm at once very excited because it does add a little bit of cultural legitimacy, although I'm, not dependent on being legitimized by anybody. But I'm excited about it, and I'm also trepidatious about it for the reasons that you mentioned, the kind of grossness of it. Suddenly, it becomes just another commodity. It becomes a pinned butterfly under glass. And also for the reason that I will say that while it's been great to see lots of new academic writing come out about magic, a lot of times it's very clear that in many cases, those people haven't actually done any magic.
Yeah.
I've worked with a lot of academic writers who wanted to write academic things for various projects that I've worked on, and the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life, as they say, and
Yes.
academics are quite good at killing things with analysis of things that they haven't actually practiced. And my experience of magic is when you actually do it, it becomes profoundly simple and intuitive and straightforward, and not, very much not what you get in academic papers about it, which tend to overly complicate it and how do I say it, confuse the signifier for the signified, not just the signified, but the ongoing evolutionary process of somebody's life. I think that when we look at things like sigils or artwork that are left behind, or texts that come out of magical traditions, and all the things that are held up in academia or held up in museum settings or art world settings as examples of the magical traditions, a lot of times what people are seeing there are the byproduct of magic. They're the cast off. That's something that was important to somebody at one point in their personal evolution, but it holds no magic on its own as an intrinsic. It has no intrinsic magic as an object. It was just, hopefully that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. But, I would say that some of the artwork that has been the most exciting, or at least provocative, of the last less than 100 years. I'm thinking about like Jackson Pollock, let's say. Like, his artwork was arguably exactly what you're talking about. It was the result of his kinesis. And, he was interested in magic, perhaps not as much as some of the other artists like, Seligman, or even like Kandinsky, and so on and so forth. A lot of the fathers of abstraction and abstract expressionism. But I don't know. So I curated a show called Language of the Birds, Occult and Art, and it was a survey of 100 years of occult influenced artists. And there were some folks who believed that the art that was hanging on the wall was a spell. And there were others who just were making art about magic. And then there were others who, to your point, the art were artifacts or byproducts or the shell of a ritual that had already taken place. And I think it's all interesting, to be honest. I just think, I'm a real believer of whatever works and whatever gets you there. And so I think there is room in a museum context for magic to happen or magic to be taking place. I think imagery is some of the most powerful magic that there is. So I don't know. I don't know that all artworks are the leftovers. I think that a lot of artwork is the magic itself.
Okay. Well, let me modify what I said then. I feel, yes, okay, I agree. And particularly when you look at people like Austin Spare, whose art was specifically to accomplish occult effects and things like that. Yes. Okay. Okay. I went too far with what I was saying there, but what I was trying to pull out, my underlying hesitancy was just seeing, magic become a museum piece instead of a living tradition that people are.
Yes.
And also I will say, magic really is it's so crucial to the artistic process. When you talk about the last 100 years, the most exciting art has been magically related. I don't think that's a mistake at all. I think that, magic is the thing that artists need to get inspiration in a way, instead of just moving around combinations of things that already exist.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful, Jason. I think that's true. And I also think that magic is a tool that expands our imagination and our insides, for lack of a better word. And it's really hard to talk about because anyone who has done magic knows that it's ineffable. It transcends language. It's one of the reasons I think music and poetry and visual art are perhaps better tools for engaging with magic than just prose. Because it's really, really difficult to express or transmit those experiences through language alone. But to your point, I would never want to see magic become fossilized or calcified. And I think that's what you're saying too. And I suppose that if someone comes to a museum show and learns about the tradition of magic making and art making, being deeply related to each other, I would hope that they would then be inspired to go home and do some magic themselves. But, it's not for everybody.
But it seems to be for a lot more people now than it was 10 years ago. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on the sudden surge in popularity of magic and of people becoming interested in magic, whether it's in a real way. Well, I guess every way is a real way, but let's just say what their level of engagement, the level that they're engaging with magic at, the angle that they're engaging with magic at. Why do you think it's become so popular all of a sudden? What do you think is going to happen with that? Do you see this as a hopeful process? Do you think that people are getting the point? What do you think is going to happen with this?
Well, I am always hopeful, Jason, as you probably know by now.
Yes.
I have to be. I have to be. And that doesn't mean that I don't also see and honor the shadow and the darkness, which is baked into the archetype of the witch, we should say too. But I am a hopeful person, and I think magic is hopeful because the thesis statement of magic is like, if you don't like it, change it. And if you do like it, well, make it even better. And I can't think of something more hopeful than that. I think people are gravitating towards it now for a lot of different reasons. I do think we, despite the painful and arguably dark, pessimistic period that we're going through right now, I actually do see a lot more people who are growing their consciousness and who are really asking more questions about why the world is how it is, and not just accepting the systems that we were delivered and realizing this is all man-made. And so we can dream up something better. And that can be everything from our economy to the way we're relating to the environment, to our political systems, to our family or gender dynamics. I think it's across the board. And that's really exciting and exhilarating and scary too, right? It's scary to be like, wait a second, you mean we all can have a hand in building the universe with every moment of our lives? Like, that's a huge responsibility. And then, the obvious point, but the internet, man, suddenly this stuff is more accessible. We've been able to find the others, as Timothy Leary famously said, and where you might think, oh my God, I'm a freak, I'm a weirdo, this is going to scare people. Thanks to the internet, we have been able to find each other and realize hey, there's a lot of cool, sane, healthy people with strong critical thinking skills who are still gravitating towards this. And gosh, there must be some value to it. It's not just me having this odd predilection. And that's very affirming.
It's a huge deal.
Yeah. And then, lastly, there's just more access to resource and materials. Like the fact that I can go on the Cornell University website and pull up every witchcraft treatise ever is pretty amazing, right? I mean, it's wild how these texts are suddenly available to us in these images. And so I think that's really catalyzed things too.
It is amazing. And I'm totally on the same page with you. The idea that we have infinite ability to mold and shape not just our own lives, but, every inherited construct that we've been given is exhilarating, not only exhilarating, but absolutely necessary and critical that we do it because of things like the ecological crisis and various things that are going on in the world. But at the same time, that is scary for a lot of people. A lot of people are shitting themselves. And I think that they're once confronted with I guess that lack of structure or that openness or that personal responsibility, that's really scary for a lot of people. And I
That's the
suspect that,
word. Yes, responsibility and
yeah,
accountability. Like, not very sexy, magical words, but holy fuck, like, that's what we all have. I mean, we all have the responsibility, the accountability, the ability to make the world, what we want it to be. And my goodness, there's certainly a lot of shitty people who have figured it out. I'd love it for more loving people to unlock, that tool chest too.
totally. At the same time, I feel like, I suspect that at least on one level, one of the things that's driven the resurgence of the far right and not just people like Donald Trump, but the whole alt-right phenomenon and
Mm-hmm.
various other fellow travelers in that sphere is there seems to be a real terror of the things being that open. People want to go back. They want to go back to structure. They want to go back to the 1950s or before the Enlightenment, God forbid. And it's almost like a willful. It is. They are choosing an alternate reality, but they're choosing, instead of seeing the pressing complexities and frightening issues of the 21st century, they're choosing to live in this. I don't even know what to call it. This alternate reality of them being threatened by the changes that the world is going through, or traditional structures being threatened, or whatever it is. And that I almost feel like, it's like an allergic reaction that people are having at the cultural level, where we've finally, after all these hundreds of years, gotten people up to the precipice where it's like, here you go, total freedom, make life as you want it. You are now optimized as a free individual. It's all for you. Go have it. Life is a buffet. Enjoy it, but be responsible and look after each other. And instead of, I think we see this with people, not just who do magic, but certainly with psychedelics or just with life. Some people open up to life, and some people shut down in fear. The escape from freedom, as Eric Fromm put it. And a lot of people are doing that right now. They're shutting down in fear and trying to scramble back as fast as they can to the old repressive structures, because they're not ready to, not ready for freedom or whatever it is. And that's a very dangerous position we're in, and it seems to be something that is being fought at a magical level even. I'm going to do a show with Gary Lockman very shortly. I'm reading his new book about magic in the age of Trump, so I'm sure he'll have some thoughts on that. But
well, one thing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, because you are much more studied in that world than I am, but it strikes me that a lot of that energy is very toxic masculine energy. Yes, I'm sure there are some women who are part of that world, but would you agree that it's mostly kind of this toxic masculine current?
For the most part. I mean, in as much as yesterday on Twitter, I saw that Charlie Kirk, this young Republican, is having the Young Conservative Women's Summit in Texas, and the headliners are Donald Trump Jr. and Jordan Peterson. So yes.
Good Lord. My stars. And as we know, there's all kinds of like internalized misogyny that a lot of women have, which is, I think part of the same thing. And anyway, the reason I'm asking you these leading questions is because I do think we're having this crisis of, and I know it's very risky to speak in dualities and polarities, but nonetheless, I will still say that there's this like malnourished masculinity that has just gotten way out of control. And at the root of it is deep, deep woundedness and pain. And as you said, fear. And I don't know, sometimes when I'm being very clumsy about it, because I know it's more nuanced than this, I think like, well, witchcraft is the antidote, because witchcraft is so much about honoring everything as a cycle and honoring both sides, masculine and feminine, and yes, doing some course correction spiritually in terms of raising up the divine feminine energy, which I think we all need to do regardless of the gender that we identify as. And so I don't know. And sometimes when I'm anthropomorphizing the earth, which I don't know is the smartest thing to do, but when I am thinking about the earth as Gaia and the mother and feminine and all of those things, it does seem like there's this war. It's like this war against feminine energy, this war against, fecundity, creativity, generativeness, and the cycles too. And it's really, really sad. And I'm not sure how to correct it other than, Tori Amos said something recently that I keep coming back to. And she says, you can't out destroy destruction. You can only out create it. And so, yes, I would love for all of those dudes to get like a big squishy hug and learn to love themselves. And I hope they do. But in the meantime, I want to be on the side of creating alternatives and widening the circle of spirit and magic and kindness and compassion, and invite everybody into it and just make the circle wider and wider and wider.
Yeah, I agree. And there certainly is that, the hostility towards certainly things that we would traditionally consider feminine and against femininity, both within people and externally in nature. And I think that it's almost, I think that's a part of it. I think that there's almost like a hatred of life. And we have to consider, I think, also the role not only of big oil money, people like the Koch brothers. I mean, a lot of this stuff is very, very well funded. And it's tempting to say it emerges organically out of something like some type of collective unconsciousness or something like that. But also, we have to recognize that a lot of it is very, very well funded by specific concerns who want to make the world safe for big oil and things like that. And also, I don't think we can discount the role of evangelical religion in it also. I think that the fear is not just of loss of masculine status or white status. I think that there's underneath that, there are some very, very fundamental religious scripts running, particularly apocalyptic scripts, which is why I wrote that book. I was trying to make people aware of that.
That these people, and not to paraphrase your amazing book too much, but that these folks want to accelerate the destruction of the earth so they can get into the afterlife and get into heaven and get raptured up. I mean, that's the kind of Cliff's Notes version of it, right, Jason?
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah.
Please. I mean, what am I missing?
Well, that's the Cliff Notes version. I think that Christianity, in particular, evangelical Protestant Christianity in particular, has become obsessed with the idea of hastening the apocalypse. But it's not just Christianity, and it's not just the Judeo-Christian traditions or Islam either. I mean, it's present in Buddhism. There's apocalyptic aspects of lots of religions all over the world. But you can probably trace that back to, I don't know, people are afraid to die. Maybe they want the world to end with them if they're going to die. I don't know what it is.
It's so weird because, I mean, hey, look, I don't even know that I hate to say it, I don't know that they're wrong. Like, we don't know anything, Jason. We have no idea. And I think that's what terrifies people the most. Like, for all of our knowledge, we still don't know what happens when we die. We don't know where we come from when we're born. The biggest questions of our lives, we still don't have answers to. And that excites me. I mean, I love mystery, and but some people are terrified by it and they want definites. And if they think that that's, a definite result or a definite answer, that's going to make them feel more secure, even if it's a false security.
Right. Yeah, one of the most exciting things about magic for me is the idea simply of taking an experimental approach to matters of spirit and consciousness instead of getting received dogma and turning it into a scientific process, for lack of a better word, and trying to figure that stuff out through experiments and trying to do things and see what happens. And I think that is a good thing to push for at a cultural level, the idea of, because I feel like as a culture, we're caught in between a rock and a hard place. On one end, I think, most, at least, let's say coastal people have rejected religion for the most part and are rightly hold fundamentalism in at arm's length, and see the danger of accepting dogma and have moved on past it. But at the same time, on the other end, I think that most people in that place, let's say our cultural elites, have also rejected out of hand the idea that spirit or consciousness or any of that is real at all. They've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And one of the things that I would hope to push for, and that I think that the magical traditions in general can help with, is opening that up to experiment, opening up to that this is a valid area of research instead of just it's one or the other. It's either fundamentalist dogma or New Age woo, or on the other hand, it's I don't know, to be ignored completely.
Let me tell you a couple things that give me hope. First of all, have you been following Michael Pollan's latest book and book tour about psychedelics?
Yeah, I have. I haven't listened to anything he's done, and it's hilarious to me that guy only started doing psychedelics in his 60s or something like that, which is amazing. That's amazing.
Totally. And of course, we know Daniel Pinchbecks of the world and so on, and the McKennas and such have been mining this territory for far longer. And let's not even talk about shamans and indigenous people who've known this for how many thousands of years. But I will say that for someone like a Michael Pollan to be writing the book that he wrote and to be sticking his neck out and, tarnishing his reputation or whatever, that excites me, that kind of thinking, that kind of writing, and that's mainstream right now. The other thing, and this is going to sound weird, but just see if you'll go with me here, Jason. The other thing that I think gets discounted all the time is the kind of self-help movement or, soft Oprah style new age movement, because it's marketed to women. And yet so many women are receiving these messages about just the things we're talking about. Maybe they're not going to, set up an altar or do the kind of rituals we're doing, but they're suddenly practicing mindfulness, or they're meditating, or they're, thinking about what's their highest purpose, how can they serve spirit. And I don't know. I sometimes think that because it is in the kind of female cultural clubhouse that people dismiss it, and yet I think it has a huge influence on people in a way that gives me a lot of hope.
It has a tremendous influence, and just absolutely phenomenal at the cultural level, and you're completely right about that. And yeah, that's. I feel like that's something that's of profound interest to probably the majority of women now. Am I right about that?
I mean, I don't have numbers around it, but I would say that, my experience in terms of who comes to my classes or my lectures or who my fans are, for lack of a better word, it's mostly women. It's some men, but it's mostly women. And I think that's wonderful. I mean, I'm thrilled to have as much, whoever is listening to the message, wonderful. But I do think there's still that tarnish that when you're a woman talking about quote unquote feminine or soft, touchy feely things, that men don't hear it or don't look at it or don't seek it out. I mean, I was just saying this to my husband the other day, who's a very evolved, amazing man. But, I listened to the Oprah podcast, and she has some of the most incredible philosophers and thinkers of our time on there. Every monk, teacher, spiritual guru, I mean, everything, just the free wisdom that she puts out just on her podcast alone every week. And I listen to it all the time, and a lot of women I know listen, but the dudes don't, because it's Oprah. And I kind of don't get it. I don't get it. You don't like her style, or it embarrasses you, or I'm not saying you, Jason, but it's weird to me that whereas I feel like if the same teachers were, suddenly put on like the David Letterman Netflix series that he has now, people would suddenly pay attention more. And that just like bothers me. But I also, I think it's the truth of it. I think that if more men were exposed to this kind of thinking, like, you're a rare person, Jason, you really are. And a lot of the men that I know that are attracted to magic, and yes, there's the alt-right shitty version of it, which is its own problem, but a lot of the men that I know who are attracted to, I don't know, self-improvement, change, ritual, magic, are some of the most incredible people I've ever met in my life. And I maybe they'll listen to you more than they'll listen to me just because you're a dude. And I hope that you really take that responsibility on. And I know you have for a long time, but we need more people like you and less people like the alt-right version of masculine magic, for sure.
Well, thank you. Okay, so where do we go from here? And we should probably wrap up, but
yeah. I mean, we can talk about some of the projects I'm working on if you want me to get a little pluggy.
I just meant life, the universe, and everything. Where do we go as a culture? But yes, we can talk about yes, but please plug away. But yeah, I was thinking about
that out.
Yes.
Where do we go from here? I just think, I'm hopeful, because what I'm seeing is that more and more people are becoming interested in witches and witchcraft and magic and inner transformation. But that's because that's what I'm paying attention to. And for those who are paying attention to the alt-right, toxic, scary version of magic, and it's important we keep our eye on that too. I'm sure it looks a little scarier, and I don't know. I suppose I'm choosing not to be blind to that stuff, but again, to just focus my energy on generating more of the experiences and relationships that I think are valuable and I think are crucial for elevating the world and bringing us closer together.
Well, I will continue doing my part too. So where can people find you? What should people look for? You have a book coming out sometime in the near future. Where would you like to direct people to go?
Yeah, well, in the most immediate future, I have been doing this podcast called The Witch Wave, where I interview all kinds of amazing folks who either identify as witches or use the archetype of the witch in their work. And that's available everywhere you can get podcasts, so give it a listen. The book is coming out at some point next year. It's a little soon to give an exact date. We're hoping on the earlier side of next year, fingers crossed. And then I'm very easy to find, pamgrossman.com. My handles on everything is actually Phantasmaphile with PHs, not Fs. And that comes from a blog that I've run for a million years where I celebrate art and culture with a magical bent, phantasmaphile.com. But yeah, Instagram, Twitter is all Phantasmaphile or Witchwave Pod. So check them out.
Well, it was super lovely to have you on the podcast. Thank you for everything that you're doing. I'm wishing you huge success with the book, and it's a brave move to jump into it full time also. So best success with that and staying balanced. And hopefully I will get to have you back on the podcast once things have settled down for you a little bit.
That would be awesome. And I just love talking to you, Jason. This was a nice excuse just to get to know you a little bit better, too. I hope we have many, many more such conversations in the future, both on and off the mic.
Sounds great. Well, I'm looking forward to that.
Me too.